The topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Well, good afternoon and welcome. I've been looking forward to sharing our next guest with you. In fact, we're going to spend about 50 exclusive minutes together with Dr. John West to talk about his new book, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, Why Christian Leaders Are Failing and What We Can Do About It. The question is, what if American culture isn't collapsing because of crusading secularists? What if it's failing because many leading Christians identify more with secular elites than with their fellow believers, believe it or not? Think about that for just a moment. Those are the provocative questions posed by Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, which exposes how influential Christians, influential Christian leaders, I might say, are siding with their anti-Christian cultural captors on everything from biblical authority and science to sex, race, and religious liberty. Going beyond critique, the book identifies root causes and, more crucially, offers practical steps and strategies that you can use to help your family, church, and community stand for truth. Dr. John West will be joining us in just a moment. He is vice president of Discovery Institute in Seattle, an award-winning author and filmmaker. He has written or edited 13 books and directed a dozen documentaries. Formerly the chair of the Department of Political Science and Geography at Seattle Pacific University. He holds a PhD in government from Claremont Graduate University. Let's bring on Dr. John West to the show now. Dr. West, welcome. Good to be talking to you again, sir. How are you?
I'm great. It's a sunny day in Seattle. At least right now, it's not raining. And so that's always a good day in March.
Yes, exactly. Well, it's St. Patrick's Day. It should be, right?
And that's true, too. That's right. I'm wearing green. You probably can't see it on there, but yes.
Yeah, I've got a little bit of green stripe in this shirt, too, in honor of St. Patrick. But anyway, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. Let's give our audience a background. I mean, this is, in a sense, it is about you, but the application of what you experience goes beyond it. And I think it is a pattern of what has invaded our culture, John.
Yeah. So the basic idea is going back to the Stockholm Syndrome, which people may or may not know, but this was a infamous bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden in the 1970s, where after the people were held hostage, the bank tellers and things were held hostage, by the end of the experience, they were having grateful thoughts about the robbers who were holding them hostage.
Yes.
And so it basically stands in for this idea that people who have been abused or held captive, and I'd say culturally captive, end up identifying more with their captors than with, surrounding society. In the case of Christians, I think it's Christians in the media, in academia, in entertainment, in the churches, the pastors who've spent their life either in graduate school or with fellow professionals, these elites that have this very secular, very antagonistic view towards Christians. And they've spent years doing this, and that sort of morphs into them, that influences them, where they actually look to those as their peer groups. They're sort of secularist elites as their peer groups. So then you have these Christians who are personally Christian, but they are actually carrying water, if you will, for the secularist elites, because they've sort of unconsciously, in many ways, adopted their views. And so, as Christians, we're called to be salt and light to the culture.
Right.
But what these Christian leaders end up doing is basically so identifying with the secularist elites that they almost regard themselves as missionaries to their fellow Christians to get their Christians to sort of abandon their historic beliefs.
Right. This is amazing because we've seen this happen time in history. Of course, when I was growing up, the big notice was with Patty Hearst, right?
Yes.
When she was abducted, and then next thing you see her, and she's the bank robber now, right?
Yeah, no, that's a classic American example of that. But again, I think, and there's lots of debates among psychologists of how real that is in psychology. But I think as a shorthand description of what I saw, I mean, the reason I came to this is I kept asking the question. I would see both at my university and a lot of other places of people adopting being less like Christians and
yes,
secular culture. And why was that? And it wasn't just because they were consciously selling out or being cowardly. They actually genuinely believed the stuff that they were saying. And well, why is that? Because they spent their life with these elites who were hostile to Christianity, and they end up adopting their worldview.
Well, exactly. I mean, if you're pounded constantly with one side of the perspective and you aren't convicted enough of your own anchoring and your own foundational beliefs, I mean, it would almost be like as if all of a sudden, if Israel started siding with Hamas, right?
Yeah, that's a really good example because it's really strange in one sense. But I think, again, there are lots of examples of people who are doing this. And again, it's not just because they're trying to curry favor or they think they're being cowardly. It's they now genuinely believe the critiques of their fellow Christians. And so they actually identify more with the secular elites than they do with their fellow Christians or historic Christian teaching.
Well, it's kind of like, again, I always go to the book of Genesis. You go in the beginning and what happened in the garden. You know, the big question was of God himself. Did God really say? Once you put those foundational principles into question and you're willing to entertain any kind of doubt of these anchoring doctrinal pillars, then you start heading down a slippery road, don't you?
You do very much so. And I talk about that in my book and actually give case examples of people who've gone down that slippery slope. And, you know, the other insight that I have, I think a lot of Christians, we feel that, well, if we just had more Christians in politics, entertainment, everything would be fine. But in fact, the point that I'm trying to make in my book is we have lots of Christians who go into government, academia, entertainment. The problem is when they get there, they behave like secularists.
Right.
So it's not enough to have personally devout people. They actually have to have a better Christian worldview and understand how it applies and look less like the world. Because if we keep graduating and placing people in the positions of power who are Christians, maybe in their personal life, they go on Sundays and maybe they, have a devout feeling towards God, but then on Mondays, they act like their secularist colleagues.
Yes.
You're not going to get anything different. In fact, what you end up getting are Christians who themselves are facilitating the cultural decline and the cultural crisis we're in. And so, I think a lot of us conservative Christians, we tend to blame all the atheists and agnostics and the progressives. And I think all that's true. But what dawned on me just a few years ago is just how much of these things that we're dealing with have been facilitated actively by self-identified Christians. Exactly.
We're talking with Dr. John West. He's the author of the book, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. Well, I'll tell you, this is an enlightening book, John. And I really look at it as a gift to what you've given to all of us, including especially the body of Christ, because it challenges us to question if we are ourselves maintaining our saltiness.
Yes. And, we can talk about some specifics, but the book is really in three big parts. One is the symptoms, the documenting that we really do have a problem. But then the others are the causes and the cures. So what do we do about it? Because it's not inevitable, and cultures rise and fall. But if you end up being more faithful to, I'd say, the biblical tradition, that will have a positive impact on your culture. And so it's not inevitable if we can turn things around. And so I spend a lot of chapters focusing on what are the root causes and then what can we do about it.
Well, John, let's talk about you in terms of your experience, because this is where it began. It began, for you at the university. and you started to see this pattern arise, and here you are. You're challenged. Are you going to accommodate and cross the line and be like them, or are you going to hold to your principles?
Yeah, so for 12 years, I was a professor at Seattle Pacific University, which is a self-identified, even today, as an evangelical Christian university. So, along the lines of Wheaton or others.
Mm-hmm.
And I had tenure there as a department chair. But what was really disturbing is in the time I was there, is you could see the shift that was taking place.
What years was that, John?
So I was there from the late 90s to 2006.
Okay, all right.
So about 12 years. And then, actually, I'll tell two stories that actually sort of bookend the transformation that began even, when I left. So when I was hired, I was actually warned by some fellow faculty members that, we have a really conservative board of trustees, and they had just denied tenure to a theologian who was kind of out there. And they were thinking that they were sort of warning me that I might be worried about that. Secretly, in my heart, I was saying, great, you actually have a board of trustees that is actually trying to safeguard the mission of the institution.
Exactly.
But then jump ahead to one of the last things I did while I was there was try to help a fellow faculty member who was being denied tenure and by the faculty. And why was he? Well, there were various reasons, but the main reason, in my view, was he was a theologically conservative Christian. And so then, tragically, the board at that time, which had sort of changed, rubber stamped the progressive faculty's attempt to get rid of this person, who was theologically conservative. And so we went from a board that was actually safeguarding the integrity of the institution to, by the time I left, that they were actually rubber stamping what the worst parts of the institution were trying to push towards. And then what happened just 2 or 3 years ago, my former university was in the national news, I say not for something good, for that over 70% of the faculty, more than 7 in 10 of the faculty at that evangelical Christian school voted against the university's statement on biblical marriage.
Oh, wow.
And basically they voted no confidence in the board because the board wouldn't officially repeal it. And so, and the statement, all it said was basically marriage is designed for a man and a woman, and that's the context in which sexual relationship would be. So it wasn't, it was a pretty basic standard. And how do you have a Christian institution when more than 7 in 10 of the faculty reject biblical marriage? Well, the simple answer to that is you don't.
Exactly.
You no longer has one. And how did that happen?
You've abandoned a biblical worldview at that point, John.
You have. But really, I think that the insight that I have to share with people, that because people do see this, and when that came out, there was a lot of hand wringing. Well, how did this come about? It doesn't come about out of nowhere. And what I saw when I was at the university, it was actually, I don't blame primarily the theological liberals and progressives because they were doing what they thought was right. Mm-hmm. I think they were wrong, but they were acting in some way out of their wrong convictions. But we had a personally theologically conservative board, many from business, but some from the sponsoring church, who were themselves personally devout, theologically conservative. And when push came to shove, they were not willing, they didn't have the courage of their convictions. And the reason why you end up having 70% of the faculty against biblical marriage is that you basically had an AWOL board of personally theologically conservative. I want to just re-emphasize this. This was not a plot done by liberals. I mean, the faculty were, but the board that enabled it, that hired these people, that wouldn't get rid of the people and that hired bad people, were theologically conservative themselves. And this began to, dawn on me that, Houston, we have a problem that it's not just the people out there. If we don't basically police ourselves, if we don't, clean our own house and make sure that our fellow Christians and Christian leaders are living up to what they say they believe, how can we expect the rest of the culture to go anywhere than what it is? And so when you have, again, personally theologically conservative people not willing to have the backbone or the discernment to actually stand up for what they say they believe.
John, I can't help but feel that there was probably such a level of Bible illiteracy at that time. I would question how often these officials were in the Word of God, because I cannot suspect that somebody would be in the Word of God on a daily basis and succumb to a cultural worldview like this.
Yeah,
This is just my supposition, John.
Yeah.
I don't have any measure on it.
I think by the time it got to the level it did, where you had 70% of the faculty vote against biblical marriage, I think there's truth to that. The really defining point, I write about this in my book, for that institution, though, was when a president wanted to break the church away. It was sponsored by the Free Methodist Church, which is a theologically conservative denomination. Mm-hmm. And the president wanted to eliminate Free Methodist, the church control of the board, and just be self-selecting. And there, you can do that if you adopt a really strong statement of faith. There are some ways to do that, but the president didn't really want to do that. So he just wanted to end church control of the board. This is classic. Many people don't know. Harvard, Princeton, Yale were started out as devoutly Christian institutions.
Exactly. Right.
By the mid-19th century, they were not anymore. Mm-hmm. And largely, the first step was when they eliminated control of their sponsoring church over the board to exercise some sort of theological oversight. And so when I saw this as a faculty member happening, I was one of a handful of faculty who actually went to the board, and we raised concerns about this. And in fact, we later found out some of this was happening without the board's full knowledge or consent. And so when they did find out about it, what did they do? This was their primary failure. And I think this set really the trajectory is when they found out about it, they put a temporary stop to it, but they did not fire the president. Mm. They had a lack of nerve, because the president, I think, really had bamboozled them. But that's my opinion. But right. They did. And I later talked to a board member who was one of the few board members who actually did want to do something. There were some good. The board was divided, but the board as a majority would not fire him. And so ultimately, he just regrouped and eventually got his way. And once they changed the board composition so that a majority of them were not chosen by the Free Methodist Church, which had a strong statement of faith,
right,
you ended up getting a divided board. And so there really was no longer a majority, I'd say a biblical majority on the board to do anything other than, if you had to formally repeal like their statement of faith or biblical marriage, you needed a supermajority to do that. So the minority of the board could prevent them, but they couldn't actually do anything with regard to hiring or firing. And that made it inevitable what happened. Mm-hmm. But the board that decided it, there were parachurch leaders. I think they were in the word, but they were informed, because there were some of us faculty members who brought them and said, "What are you doing?" and sketched out, but they wouldn't listen. And as this, I've seen time and again, people who personally, now sometimes they're not maybe being truthful, but I think in the case of the institution I was at, they were personally devout. Not being wise or discerning, or not being able to have the backbone to stand up because they have a wrong view of Christian love. Christian love is imperative, but it's not the same as being nice to everyone and never giving offense. Yes. That's not Christian love. That's fake love. If you see someone who's about to destroy themselves, it's not loving to say, "Oh yeah, go. I'll actually give you something to help you. I'll give you a dose of fentanyl. That gets you off." That's not Christian love.
Yes. We'll change your body parts for you as well. We're talking with Dr. John West, the author of the book, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. John, what you bring up here, and I'm glad you talked about, the selection of the staff, because this seems to be a continuing saga in academia, that suddenly conservative people of faith find themselves inundated with very liberal academics that overwhelm their institutions. What happens? How does that come about?
So, and it's not just academia. I've been an elder in 2 congregations, and we experience some of these pressures, in our churches when hiring staff people. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because too few board members understand the principle from politics. I'm a former political science professor, so I get some of the things in politics, which is policy. Personnel is policy.
Yes, exactly.
So you can, if you don't have the right people, it doesn't matter what standards you have, because they're not going to follow it. And so I think too few board members or elder boards at churches actually pay attention to that. And so how does this happen? Well, in academia, it happens that faculty usually tell the board, "Well, you're not experts. we're the experts, so just trust us. Your goal is to raise money for us and basically to rubber stamp what we want. And unfortunately, too many board members buy into that. And I'd say, yeah, the board members aren't experts in everything, but I'd say the number one goal of a board member, either of an academic institution or a K through 12 school or a church, is
or how about a government?
Or a government is mission fit.
Yeah.
Is understanding and defending, making sure you're actually doing what fits your mission.
Exactly.
And so when I came to actually Seattle Pacific, the board was very involved. The reason why it could deny tenure to someone is that those board members wanted to make sure that anyone they gave tenure to actually was a biblical Christian. Mm-hmm. Now, faculty hated that because they thought that was micromanaging. But I'm saying you've got to get the right personnel. And similarly, when I was an elder of a couple different churches, you have ministry positions, and if you ask for someone's faith story, they're going to give you it, but you've got to ask specific questions. I mean, if your church stands up like that Jesus is the way to salvation, there aren't any others, or that marriage is just between a man and a woman, or that you believe the Bible is actually absolutely true, you've got to ask those specific questions. And what I would see often when bad people were about to be hired, it was primarily because the people didn't ask pointed questions. For the most part, I mean, people end up telling the truth. There are some exceptions, and you can go out on social media and find out what they really believe. But the thing is, the people who are actually trying to hire weren't even asking the questions. I think in some cases because they were afraid of the answers.
Yes.
But so if you're a board member or an elder or deacon, make sure that for church staff or school staff, that the things that are non-negotiable to you, and I think biblical truth should be non-negotiable. I think biblical sexuality should be non-negotiable. You ask specific questions and get people on the record, often in writing. Another tactic is, say, if someone's trying to shoehorn someone else in, they may say, well, just trust me, I'll interview them and then I'll report back.
Right, yeah.
Well, I actually give an example of this in my book where I was on an elder board and that was suggested. And we said, no, we really want their written answers to these specific questions. We don't just want, and you know what happened? When we asked for that, the person withdrew.
Yes. Because
they didn't want to answer that. And that was good. But I now think, if we had gone the way that someone had suggested, well, just let me talk to them. That's more conversational. They likely would have heard what they wanted to hear.
Yeah, of course.
So having these lists of very specific questions and even getting them in writing is one tool that a board member should put in their little toolkit.
Right. Well, John, this is the reason why 9 out of 10 people are not very happy at the jobs they're doing. They're round pegs and square holes because there's a failure, first of all, for them to know themselves and who they are. And then the person that hires them, as you say, they get in a situation and they want to hear what they want to hear because they just look at it as a requirement. I've got an opening here and I've got to get it filled, as opposed to having the right person there. Because as we talked about earlier, I mean, to me, that's Christian love. Christian love is accommodating and making sure people are the right fit, that they can exercise the giftings and talents that God's blessed them with. Don't force them into something that, they're going to hate and be miserable and make everybody else miserable around them.
And it's also what some of the board members don't think about. And I think this is that the love is also, who are you trying to serve? If you're a church, you're trying to serve your congregation to the glory of God. If you're a school, you're trying to mentor these students. It is not loving to the students or to your congregation members of hiring someone who is working athwart your mission.
Yes, exactly.
And so what happened at, say, Seattle Pacific in the years after I left, things became so bad. So they authorized a campus group with people who don't have biblical sexuality. I'll just put it that way, as an official campus group. And the atmosphere changed so that by the last few years, there was actually a group of conservative students who petitioned the board because it was now becoming so hostile that if they were trying to articulate a defense of biblical sexuality when it comes to LGBTQ or something else, they were being intimidated.
Yes.
And my question for the board who basically authorized that. They thought they were being loving to people who were rejecting biblical truth. But what they don't realize, but by they weren't really being loving to those people. But even if they thought they weren't thinking about the students who were trying to uphold biblical truth, who are now being intimidated and bullied.
Yes, exactly.
When this other view takes over the campus. And so this, again, many of the people who think they're being loving are actually being cruel. Mm-hmm. They're being cruel to the people who are on the way of error, that they're not rescuing that, but they're being cruel for the victims of those people. Once it takes over the institution becomes utterly intolerant towards the faithful few.
Yeah, what's the difference with these poisoning ivy universities right now, John? I mean, basically what you're saying, it's the same thing that's happening at Columbia and Harvard and these other institutions when it comes to Israel.
No, I mean, actually, unfortunately, so what you had is Christians in the late 19th century started a whole bunch of new universities because they had lost the first generation, Yale, Princeton, Harvard. What we're facing now, not with all of them, there are still some solvents, but with many of them, they're going the same path.
Right, exactly.
And some have gone too far that actually probably can't be saved. Others can be saved. And one of the reasons I wrote my book is that, depending on how far you've slid down, you can save. I mean, I would actually say if someone's listening to who knows a board member of one of these, of an institution, or they themselves are a board member, if you have 3 to 5 years of sustained good governance, you can hire good new people. You can get rid of bad people. You can actually change the trajectory of your institution. It will take discernment, and it will also take some courage, but you can do it.
Yes.
And now's the time to do it. We faced this also in the 1970s, and a lot of Christians rose to the challenge. At that time, there was widespread attacks on biblical authority, even among evangelical Christians. Out of that, you had people like Francis Schaeffer and many others who really stood up to call evangelicals back to their foundations. And I write about one story about the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, where they showed courage because they had a seminary where basically the faculty were going over to reject the Bible and reject biblical authority. And they stood firm, which meant that basically 90% of the faculty walked with the students, and everyone thought, oh, you're destroying your seminary, you're destroying your denomination. But by standing firm, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is still now the largest single conservative Lutheran denomination in the United States with 1.8 million members. And so they were blessed by God by standing firm. But so we had a lot of Christians who showed courage in the dark days of the 1970s. What we're going, in my view, through another period like that, and people need to step up. And the good news is God will honor your faithfulness. But you first have to recognize there's a problem, and then you have to be willing to do something about it.
Well, and it requires leadership.
Yes.
Really, and that's what I see is lacking on so many fronts, whether we're talking culturally, politically, in institutions that we need to count on. And I agree with you. We're talking with Dr. John West, the author of the book, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. Well, I'll tell you, this parallels so much of our society today and will cause you to rethink some of these principles and how maybe we've just allowed, because we feel like we want to accommodate, we want to be liked for whatever reason. And I think it's inherent. I think as human beings, we want to be liked. We don't want to be called a racist and that sort of thing, because I often find myself telling people when they accuse me of things like that, so I go, hey, I got to tell you, that's not my heart. And that has helped me. And I don't know, maybe that's just something that God has put into me. The Holy Spirit has given to me as kind of a shield, John. And it's interesting because when I say that to people, it causes them to step back for just a moment and kind of lower the temperature to say, okay, and then we can decide whether or not we want to, continue on with the discourse, or maybe just say, hey, look, I wish you well on your journey.
Yeah, no, that's true. And, on the race issue, the tragedy is the Bible is the biggest bulwark for human dignity and human equality, genuine human dignity and human equality in the history of humankind.
Yes.
History of mankind. It's just and so for many of the churches, and I have a chapter on this book, that were adopting, whether you call it critical race theory or not, really demeaning views that are demeaning people based on race and going against biblical equality. That was tragic on multiple counts. But it was tragic because in the name of attacking racism, they actually were advocating racism. But the biggest tragedy is the Bible is, like I said, when it comes to slavery, civil rights, the unborn, when it comes to human dignity and human equality, the Bible, all of us created in the image of God, is a huge bulwark that we should have good teaching on, rather than gravitating toward these pseudo-Marxist or other, things that actually are not Christian and actually lead to divisiveness, not wholeness, not friendship, not equality. I mean, it's really the Christian church in the last few years in America, I think, has lost its way. Many people out of the best, motives, because they wanted to, extol racial equality, which I think is right, but they were hoodwinked, if you will, by these secularist notions that actually go in the opposite direction.
Yeah. Well, what happened is people failed to check the fruit, John. What's the fruit of those institutions of Black Lives Matter?
Yeah.
What is it? Of course, we know we have a better idea today than we did back then, because everything was so emotional that facts and truth was put to the back seat or the back of the bus.
But, the really good news is, and another tragedy is, there are a lot of devout evangelicals, whether they be Hispanics or Blacks, who are teaching this really well and who argue for the importance of private Christian schooling and are doing some innovative things in inner cities to really raise up strong people. And those were not the people that the white churches were listening to.
Right.
They were listening to the race mongers, and it was just, rather than their fellow biblical believers, among Blacks, Hispanics, and they were ignoring those great resources. So I actually tell part of that story in one of the chapters of my book. And part of my book is actually to point people to resources. If you're in a church where they're trying to pummel you with some of these views and say, well, this is the view that if you have to have, my book gives insight into all these other resources that you can use to counter that, and to because it's really tragic the way that many Christians have bailed on historic Christian teaching, which gives a lot of help in all these areas, and are gravitating towards these secularist views that actually drive people into the ground and lead to terrible outcomes.
Well, John, I think it's interesting right now where the culture is I believe, maybe even unbeknownst to itself, it is starving for the truth. It is anemic when it comes to the truth. And now that the truth is starting to come out, and I think one of the key crossroads that we hit here, and I give credit to Elon Musk, when Elon Musk came in and bought Twitter and exposed everything that was going on, it was interesting how the dominoes started to fall. And then, of course, Trump's second campaign, actually his third campaign, and when he got reelected, it was interesting. I mean, the fact that he survived an assassination, somehow that gave him some credibility. And he could address some common sense things. I think some of the things he was addressing, on immigration and other issues were there, but it was just something about almost being assassinated that allowed his voice to cross over these democratic, not necessarily democratic, but demographic lines that heretofore were impossible for him to travail, right? Or traverse, I should say.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of insight there. I would say, another example that shows what the thirst for truth that you're talking about is, for the last 5 to 7 years, we were inundated in the idea that we need to give kids gender affirming care, which in fact was a euphemism for child mutilation.
Exactly.
I mean, let's just be clear. It was not gender affirming care. It was sex destructive care, and it was child mutilation.
Yeah. How is that love, John?
Exactly. Yet this is an example where many of the so-called leaders of American evangelicalism were doing their best to either avoid that issue or to even kowtow to it.
Yes.
But there were a faithful few who got really persecuted, who really pushed the issue. And then we've now seen with some of the other changes in politics, how just in like a 6-month period, how the public perception of that has dramatically changed. Because and that how most people now recognize that, at least with regard to kids, this is abuse, and they're overwhelmingly opposed to it. But imagine for the number of years where we had Christian leaders who were not willing to speak out on that clearly, and just a faithful few remnant. But the fact that now it just took a few, and then with the change on Twitter, and so you could actually have a live debate.
Yes.
When you could actually do that, people now have they understand that overwhelmingly. And so I think there is a thirst for truth, and that that makes it all the more important that Christians be salt and light right now in this moment. Because if you look at Europe right now, there isn't freedom of speech for Christians. And so we have this window.
You get jailed for speech. I mean, John, this conversation we're having right now, 4 years ago and thereafter for a couple of years, I'd be in social media jail for it.
Well, and in England, if you're praying silently outside an abortion clinic, you could literally go to jail.
Exactly.
Praying silently. And so people need to, the last few years, there was tremendous social media repression, and there's, I'd say, persecution in the United States. I write about that in my book too. But in right now, I think we have a renewed window. Exactly. And so the question is, that window isn't going to stay open forever unless we use it. Right. And so I'd say the next 2 or 3 years is absolutely critical to use the freedom we have, or else we will end up like Europe or worse. Or Canada. Canada is also...
Yeah, our supposed 51st state of the Union. But the deal is, as you say, John, that's so critical, and this is a call to the church. The opportunity is now. This is an appointed time, I believe, by God. And you've got people, especially young people, that are starving for the truth. Are you going to ignite the lamp of truth in front of your churches to let people know that God lives here and the truth is here? Because the fact of the matter is truth does exist. It's not relative. We've been told for decades, oh, it's relative. Your truth is your truth, my truth. Baloney. There's only one truth, and it comes from God. Anything apart from God is not the truth. And the churches have to doctrinally and really believe that is so, because I believe that is the answer to some of the cultural ills that we're dealing with right now, Dr. West.
I think that's true. And it might be helpful just, really quickly to mention some very specifics, because I am interested in politics, but this goes beyond politics, and it's culture, and it's also theology. So when I talk about Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, what am I talking about? Well, there's a megachurch pastor, Andy Stanley, who argues that the Old Testament is the obsolete testament, and we should literally put it to the back of our Bibles. Yeah. There's another leading Christian apologist, Mike Licona, who's done some good work on defending the resurrection, but he now argues that the Gospels are like Hollywood stories that were inspired by true events, but that the facts, the situations, even the words of Jesus were changed. So it's like a Hollywood movie. That's that accurate. So we're talking about biblical authority 101 is being sacrificed and not being stood up for. In the area of science and medicine, the most powerful Christian scientist in America for over a decade was Francis Collins, self-identified evangelical Christian. And what did he do? I don't question his personal faith. I think he's personally devout, but he oversaw the development of a tissue hub harvesting aborted baby body parts for medical research, millions of your tax dollars. And this was not directed by a materialist, by an atheist or an agnostic. It was overseen by a card-carrying, evangelical Christian. And worse than that, we talked about the gender stuff. The NIH spent millions more bankrolling some of the worst doctors and hospitals that were doing gender destructive research of puberty blockers on kids and cutting off breasts of young women. And that was also on Francis Collins's watch. In fact, he called himself an ally and advocate, his term, of the LGBTQIA movement.
And all the other alphabet.
And so that wasn't done by an atheist. That was done by a Christian. And then when we get to sexuality, People don't realize the key vote inventing a right of gay marriage, inventing a right that's not in the Constitution, did not come from a atheist, didn't even come from a Democrat. It was by Anthony Kennedy, who was known as a goody-goody in his personal life, faithful mass goer, faithful Catholic in his personal life, I guess. He was the one who imposed gay marriage on the country. And in my own home state, we had an attorney general who drove out of business a Christian grandma. Why? She was a florist and she'd serve everyone, but she drew the line at she didn't want to do special arrangements for gay weddings. They could buy things from her, including and do their own arrangements, but she didn't want to service. Well, the attorney general who drove her to where she doesn't exist in it, she had to get out of business. Bob Ferguson, who unfortunately is now our governor, was when he ran, he touted that he was this member of this local Catholic church, and he used that in his elections. And he actually, even when he was persecuting this Christian grandma, he actually published an article about how his faith impelled him to do what he was doing. So my point is that I'm an evangelical Christian, so a lot of the examples are from that in my book. But I think even if people are Catholic, this is a similar issue. During COVID, and there were different views on things with COVID, but I think one thing all Christians should have been able to agree on is that if you have lockdown orders or restrictions on churches, they shouldn't be any worse than those on private businesses. Now, I think the lockdowns were misconstrued and wrong, but for the sake of argument, okay, if they're okay. But you had Nevada, a devout Catholic governor who opened up the casinos, and at the same time put draconian restrictions on the churches.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And we had a conservative Catholic, John Roberts, who okayed that at the Supreme Court, a Bush appointee.
Right.
So, these are, again, we can blame all we want, liberal Democrats, atheists, whatever, but if you actually look at the people facilitating a lot of these bad things, they're self-identified Christians and in many cases personally devout. And so our churches need to be more consistent about, and our church-based schools, of mentoring and discipling people. Getting a personal, acceptance of Christ is great, but then what do you do with that? You have to live in accord with that. And what does that mean?
Yes, exactly. Dr. John West is with us. His book, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. And the last time we talked, John, along that list, let's go back to World War II and what happened there in Germany. It was pastors, it was Catholic priests, they all, next thing you know, they're abandoning the Bible for Mein Kampf. Yeah. If you think, but Jesus warned us and said, look, lest even the elect would be persuaded. These are warnings that are there in his words and in the Word of God. And this is why we must hold on to biblical truth.
That's exactly right. And I want to say, I'm glad you brought up history, because this has happened time and again. And I also want to say there are always faithful remnants. And of course, in Germany, there was Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others. And I say today, if someone's watching this who is feeling depressed by all this, and you're faithful and trying to do the right thing, God will honor that. In fact, the last chapter of my book focus on something I call God's surprises in history. And time and again, there have been places where Christians thought, well, the church is just going to go out of existence. It was actually in China after World War II when Mao took over. If you were likely there, you would have thought that Christianity would go defunct there. Well, there are hundreds of millions of Christians in China now. Their government is still awful, but there are hundreds of millions. And so God does amazing things. So we're not ourselves ultimately called to, it's not on us whether things are going to be successful or not. We're called to be faithful, not successful.
Exactly.
God will take care of the success. And I think God honors people's faithfulness, but he'll choose how to do that. So if you are feeling, overwhelmed here, my main message is whatever your realm of influence is, it might be just with your kids, it might be with your grandkids, it might be in your church if you're a pastor or a small group leader, it might be in your Christian school if you're a board member or a teacher, or a board member of another ministry. But in that area where you're called, be faithful.
Mhm.
And my book does give some examples of how you can do that. You don't have to solve the world's problem. The weight of the universe is not on your shoulder. We're not like Atlas carrying the weight of the universe.
Right, exactly.
It's on God's shoulders, but we are called to be faithful.
Yeah. After all, this is Jesus's church. He created it, right?
Yes.
And the thing is, it's hard for us, particularly here in the United States, to really understand Christian persecution. Yes, there's bakers that are attacked. There's grandmothers that are attacked, and lawfare and things like that. And it's really minimal compared to other countries where, Christianity is the most persecuted religion on the planet. And so, in fact, I was reminded here recently because I saw this movie, 21, which was a recall of what happened in February of 2015 with the Coptic, the Coptic Christians that were beheaded there by ISIS. And here they were, and they knew what was going to happen to them. In fact, there was originally only 20, and the way it became 21 is there was an Egyptian Coptic, and they were letting him go. And he says, "No, I stand with my brothers." And he stood with his brothers to the death, and had his head removed like the rest of them. And, and you watch this and it really convicts you to think, okay, we talk about faithfulness, but I mean, faithfulness here in the West is like having a hangnail, compared to having your head taken off.
I completely agree with this. And I think one of the big blind spots of a lot of American Christians is they don't know the levels of horrific persecution going on around the world. And I think there are great groups, Open Doors, Voice of the Martyrs, other groups that actually help with that. And that should be a priority for churches. Mm-hmm. I will say, though, I do think that if we don't want things to get worse in our culture, we do. The other problem I have is sometimes people say, well, because it's so bad, you weren't saying this, but I deal with this in the book, that one person who told me, well, that's a blessing to those people. It's not elsewhere. And so they use it as an excuse not to defend their brothers or sisters here who are going through that. And I actually have a very poignant quote from a Nigerian Christian, and Nigerians, for any people who know that, are also going through horrific persecution in northern Nigeria. And he said that, one of the things in Nigeria that I wish that the Christians in the West need to pay attention to is that we so downplayed it, especially if it was happening to another Christian group. We wouldn't defend them. Mm-hmm. And that's how we got in this situation. And they were basically warning Christians in the West not to poo-poo this, especially if it happened to someone, a Christian maybe outside their tradition, because they said, well, that's not us. They haven't come for us yet. And so I do think that we do also need to defend, even though it's not to the level of beheading or being killed. People do lose their jobs and other things in America. And I do think that Christians in their own communities need to be upholding the people in their own communities who are facing that.
Yeah, without a doubt. Well, and in the book also, and we have a little time left here, Dr. John, and you have some action points in chapter 10, for example, a call to wisdom, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So there are a lot of things that you can do. We talked about some of them that board members could do, but on the wisdom chapter, I go through a lot of things, the way other people try to manipulate you, like using words in different ways. Like there's a movement now among some to redefine pro-life to basically mean global warming. And so I try to cue people in on how language is being manipulated and things that you can do to arm yourself beforehand, so when you encounter it, you know how to deal with. And then there's just a lot of other practical things. There's another chapter with 21 things people can do, whether you're a parent or teacher. And one just very simple is do no harm, which is take an inventory. How are you using your own? Where do you go to church? Where are you giving your money, your time, talent, and treasure? And are you making sure that you're not enabling bad things? What are you doing with your own resources?
Exactly. Well, Dr. John West, cannot thank you enough. The book, of course, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, Why Christian Leaders Are Failing and What We Can Do About It. Really, the ball is in our court. As a responsible person of faith, an intentional, committed person of faith, This is again, I just think it's such a blessing, John, what you've given us. And I encourage all our viewers to get their hands on your book. The book, of course, available at all the usual places, right?
Yes, it is. And if people want more information, they could also go to the book website, which is STOCKHOLMSYndromeChristianity.com. A lot of free resources on that website.
Well, Dr. John West, thank you so much for being with us. Take care. God bless.
Thank you, Bill.
Appreciate you. Great. Okay, you got it. Well, I'll tell you, what a treat, huh? He's just an awesome academic and fellow citizen of the faith. I want to thank you for joining us. I hope this has been a blessing to you, as it has been to me. I thank you for your time. As we wrap things up, I want to read this portion of St. Patrick's prayer on this St. Patty's Day, if it's okay with you. I love this. One of my good friends, Gene Watson, has put this to music. And if you ever get a chance, check it out on YouTube. It is St. Patrick's breastplate. And she has such a great story, but you will be greatly blessed. But the prayer goes, Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. May God bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you. May he be gracious unto you and give you peace. Thanks for being with us. God bless.